I don't know, you guys have been watching a bit of the Vietnam War 10-part series of the Vietnam War on PBS, as I have, by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. And it's pure intense. Why? Because I was reminded while I was growing up, the country that is torn by war, in addition to a much divided, politically divided family. And I came to realize what really helped me, consoled me, were stories, endless stories by my grandparents, my parents, countless aunts and uncles, and other friends of the family, and of course teachers. And these stories, in a way, became so essential later, gradually, when I left, I don't know, in 1990, I think came to New York 1986. But in then 96, I was asked to write what to become a memoir, which was supposed to be published by George Bazilla. I handwrite everything I do, and the whole manuscript was destroyed along with 80-something% of my work by Sandy, so I don't have it. But the idea was that stories are the one that we tend to remember, the one that, whether it's epic or uneventful ones, but the one we remember are the ones that help shaping and forming who we are. And that's how it all began for me. In 1968 was the Tet Offensive, as you remember, in Hue, the imperial city of Vietnam. And the whole family found refuge in a Buddhist temple, where I remember asking my grandmother, there's 2 frescoes of Buddhas in profile. One sitting under the Bodhi tree, and the demon Mara was attacking him with thousands of arrows. And what came out in the end, in his back, behind his back, thousands of bouquet of flowers. And I remember asking her, why couldn't he be killed by the arrows? And she said, they couldn't kill him because he's not there. As you remember, I'm telling the story because it's the burning monk during the war. It's the same idea. Being there is not at all different from the word nirvana, what it conveys, a burnt string, so to speak. So that story was very important because I asked her the same thing about Buddha's life. Why did he leave his family, his wife and son? And she said he took a journey to discover himself, which is not like taking a trip because you know where you're going. There's a duration and there's a destination that you arrive to. The journey is filled with uncertainty and intrigues. And I always felt that's how I think about artists. They undertake journeys, you know, and that idea is so important to how I began to undertake my own when I came to New York in 1986. And the journey is so essential, and particularly the second story, which I shared with you briefly, was in 1972 when the family, my home, was destroyed, was bombed in Quang Tri, the bombing in Quang Tri in 1972. And in order to console me again, my father told the story about Carl Valentin, the great cabaret performer, writer, film producer, a personality, very important, essential figure of the Weimar Republic in the late 20s to early 30s. He told the story of himself dressed up like a beggar in the AM in the public park, walking around where the lights were along the edges of the stage for a good 10 minutes. And out of the blue, the policeman appeared and say to him, "What are you doing in the public park 2 in the morning, sir?" He said, "I'm looking for my keys." And he said, "Well, let me help you then." So the two of them walk around for another 10 minutes or so in silence around the edges where the lights are. And he certainly stopped the policeman and said to him, "You sure you lost your key here, sir?" He said, "No, I lost my keys over there." And he pointed in the dark to the audience. And so he said, "Why not looking over there then?" He said, "There's no lights over there." And I remember hearing the story and told to myself, wherever it takes, when I grow up, I'm going to look for my keys in the dark. So that's the beginning of how I articulate the notion of journey. Even when I would step on dot pool and whatnot, I will do it. So with that, I'd like to make a brief introduction to all of my friends. Shahzia Sikander is an artist who I came to know pretty much right after your having graduated at Grizzly. She have always able to move so fluidly between the boundaries and borders of various culture as she undertake in various medium, from painting to drawing, printmaking, animation, large-scale installation, and recently even mosaic and glass painting, which was a commission at Princeton University. Among her awards is, of course, was it 2006 that you got MacArthur? And she's just amazing artist and a dear friend. So that's how I became friends. You interview an artist and you become his or her friend. I would say 99% guarantee. On Lucas' left is Shirin Neshat, amazing artist, a dear friend also. I don't know, I think I first saw Shirin show at the probably Franklin Furnace in 1993, The Woman of Allah. I was blown away by their discipline and utter severity, very compelling and challenging at the same time. And then I also, again, blown over by the two videos. I think it was Turbulent. What after Turbulent, Shirin? Rapture! Rapture was so intense, I can go on talk about Shirin forever. But I think Woman Without Man, her first feature, which I have the privilege watching it before it was screened, which won her the best director in the Venice Biennale. I don't know, Shirin is just amazing. She just recently got an award from the imperial family in Japan. Just got back a few days ago and cooked an amazing dinner with Shoja Azari, her partner, last night. So I'm feeling great seeing her tonight also. Jonas, how to describe Jonas? Jonas need no introduction. Jonas once was in Lithuania, asked by a journalist there. This man say, "What do you do? Where are you?" Actually. And Jonas say, "I was born in Lithuania. I live in New York, but my country is culture." Isn't that cool? That's what I want to do. And Jonas, it's so amazing. In 1954, I think I was in third year in college when I read Film Culture. That's when I got really obsessed with his incredible publication. And then several years later, he started writing regularly for Film Culture and The Village Voice. A decade later or less, he, of course, helped to co-found it, definitely Filmmaker Cooperative and Cinematic, which later turned to Anthology Film Archives. I'm very, very honored and pleased that I now just joined the board a few months ago, and we have a lot of work to do, which somehow all of this story are contained in the interview, so we'll definitely touch on it. Lucas Zwirner is an old soul in a young body. When this whole anthology came about, I asked Lucas to basically co-author or editor with one of our amazing writer, Jared Ernest, and they were able to select this particular 16 interviews, which was terrific. If I were to be the editor, I will be sent back on the boat and to Vietnam, believe me. It's great that they did it. And elegantly, Lucas was able to do it in an incredible, flexible, inexpensive book that artists, young artists particularly, would pick up and read when they feel like it in the studio and throw it on the floor, or read on the train, on the park bench. And all of those things, it's all contained in that book. So I feel I'm in debt to Lucas, a dear friend. And with that, you want to take it over and I lay back?
You can lay back.
Thank you.
We've done this. Yes, Phong. It's not the first time that Phong and I have had to sort of have this on stage back and forth. And I realized today what the relationship is. If you're the guy looking in the dark for the key, I'm sort of the light trying to shine wherever you go in the darkness. I feel like that's my role in these conversations, is to sort of illuminate where we go, or at least try to. And I think what struck me the way you started, and you say it in the introduction, is the role of stories. And the way you read stories, you mentioned in your introduction Vasari's lives, you mentioned Johnson, you mentioned a number of books, and the lives of a number of artists, people that you knew. And so I thought maybe you could start us off, and then we could move down and hear really about one or maybe two essential stories, formative stories, that ended up making up the narrative you tell about yourself. I mean, that's really what so draws, I think, everyone into these interviews, is the way in which the story that you read can become or inform the story that you tell yourself about who you are. And so maybe one key story, and then we'll hear from everybody, whether it's about an artist. I mean, I think ideally an artist would be an interesting place to start, but sort of the narratives that affected you most, perhaps early on.
Well, you want to start with Jonas?
Yes, actually.
Let's start with Jonas.
Let's start with Jonas.
Why did you have to do that? Because I have nothing to tell. You know, I'm not an artist, my journey is not one that, you know, a journey, you know, you have like certain willpower, you walk ahead, you know, you enjoy the journey. But I'm more like falling into spaces that open and are there, and I fall in, and I then try to swim through it. My journey is very peculiar. It's not of my choice. I don't make choices. I deal what is right there immediately that attacks me. It's like my whole life is like kung fu, like reacting to what I'm facing, what falls upon me, and dealing with it, and dealing with no thinking. If you begin to think, you are lost. Doing intuitively, and yes, yeah, karate, kung fu. Yes.
I'll ask this, you know, in your interview you talk about, I mean, your life story, the way you're telling it now sounds in a way more random than what you talk about in the interview, which is that there are certain things that you've been completely dedicated to. Once you decide, there are things that you need to solve.
No, there are things that are persistently coming my way, and it's not my choice. And coming my way determined by others, and I have just to fight. I have to deal with it. So persistency, it's not of my choice. Right. It is from outside.
Then I guess I'll try it sort of from another angle. Are there any...
No, that was the right angle, you know.
Are there any, this is really the original question, are there any stories or really people that, I mean, inspire is maybe the wrong word, but stories that inform or that you think about, narratives around people that shape maybe how you see yourself, whether it's a literary character or a...
I don't see myself. I cannot see myself. So only some memories, some come and I write them down. Or of course, there are, you know, I have gone, you know, I have lived so many years that there are many, many memories that are sort of constantly returned to me at certain points. You know, but I would not choose any of them as the like it happens and then it goes and then something else happens because I'm not there. In a sense, I'm not there. It just passes through me. I learned not to take it seriously and not to permit with the first moment when, you know, by now it's everybody is telling that story when the Soviets marched into Lithuania and I grabbed my little camera and to take the first photograph in my life, because my brother had given me a present, a still camera. And there are tanks, Russian tanks rolling along the dusty road. How visually, how beautiful the dust, you know, and the tanks. And the trucks full of soldiers. I run and I snap, click. And the soldier, one of the captains, runs to me, grabs my camera, rips out the film, throws it on the ground, and rubs with his boot into the dust of the road. So that is how naive I was. While grown-ups did not run, did not go to the road of the marching, you know, army. They looked through the corners of the window, pulled the curtains to the side and peeked because they knew what it means. I knew nothing. You know, and that is really how my life has gone all the time. As a naive, I don't know what life is. I have no idea. And I always fell into like, okay, now I'm in a forced labor camp together with war prisoners and the French, Italian, Russian, and something is wrong with the soup. The soup is full of worms, but you cannot complain. You cannot complain to the army that you are a slave. You are a slave. And you don't know what will happen if you complain about it. So, but somebody has to complain. So they come to me because they have noticed that I'm totally naive. I have no idea what's all about. And they say, well, can you go and complain for us? They chose me. And I'm naive, and to me, so what? Okay, I will do that. And I went and I complained, and of course the German said, nothing wrong, the soup is prima. And of course I understood immediately from the tone that that's it, don't complain further, don't say anything else. And of course, he looked at me and noticed that, you know, this stupid kid there, what does he know? So that's my life. I'm that stupid kid going through the world and reacting in a kung fu manner to whatever I'm facing.
So maybe, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing, Jonas. Maybe make it a little more general as we move to you and think about it in terms, I mean, really, now it's not just, you know, literary characters, whatever, but the formation of narrative in general, maybe early experiences that then become codified as you get older or affect, you know, the story you end up telling about yourself, which is what the interview process sort of brings out.
Well, I think about what Phong said about the journey, the story, and I think about what you said about the naivete. I came from Iran to this country with this naive, romantic idea of becoming an artist early on when I was 17 years old. And like the two of you, my life took a different course because of political situations, because I came from a very warm family, and 2 years later, the Islamic Revolution happened, and came the walls in Iran, so we could not travel to Iran, and the war broke out with Iraq. And then there was, of course, a very strong anti-Iranian sentiment all over America because of the hostages. So I remember that the paralysis that I felt, I came with this naive idea, oh, I'm going to be an artist, and suddenly that all went out the window, and I felt completely handicapped as a young girl, really. And I couldn't even, you know, not only go to Iran, but I was basically separated from the family for 12 years. And it took me many years, and I actually literally dropped art altogether for another 10 years, and eventually went to Iran, you know, 12 years later. But when I think about my narrative or this journey in being an artist, I realized that those 12 years were the most significant part of my life in terms of hitting the bottom and being really, you know, terrified of the world, and being separated from the family and feeling so insecure in this country. And since then on, my work has been an elaboration of facing my sort of deepest anxieties in terms of feeling forever uprooted. And then the stories that I embrace tend to be about other women who have been artists but have had equally kind of complicated journeys as artists. So my work is not autobiographical, I'm not interested, but I am somehow finding that I gravitate toward other artists, women artists, who've had very difficult political.
And so how were you drawn to then sort of women without men? How did that, you talk about that a lot in your interview here from some years ago, but you know, this transition into narrative, into that specific narrative, how did that happen? That of course is totally related to, you know, what we're talking about.
Partially started because the woman writer is been in prison for many times, once for 5 years, because of the book of Women Without Men. She was one of the four most important women writers, and she was institutionalized, mentally ill, and she's separated from her child, and she's living in exile. So I felt this intense desire to pay a tribute. But also the story of Women Without Men is, it's about a story of exile. It's about this woman that run away from the society and all the ills of their lives to take refuge in an orchard that then they create their own society and create their own universe. So it was a magic realism novel that I found extremely metaphorically interesting in terms of people who run away and try to create their own worlds, and even though it was a surrealistic world. And so both her literature and who she was, I think, and her madness, the way that she had integrated into the characters, the 4 women, the 5 women in the book. So I found that I identified with all of the characters.
So in a way, it was the story she was telling and her story as a person, some combination of the two that made it into subject matter. Maybe I can bring it over to you and sort of ask the same question, I guess, that we've been asking, maybe what your take and your experience with narratives and stories that have shaped you.
Well, what shaped me as an artist, or what drove me towards art, was growing up in Pakistan, but definitely in the 80s, the military dictatorship. And that is the early stage of US engagement in the region. it's been there, but the sort of influx of refugees and the Afghan war and the unfolding of that, so you start seeing ruptures in the culture, which are very different from the 70s and 60s period. And there's a certain malaise. I was studying math, so my interest in art was really much later. And it was also because the National College of Art, which used to be the Mayo College of Art, and Kipling was also the president of the school. So like we're talking about a very sort of colonial residue that one is unraveling. And so art was about application. So then when I joined, I thought, okay, National College of Arts is where there's co-education. This is when Hudud ordinances, which are restricting women's rights, are looming large. And co-education is dissipating. Religion is being institutionalized. So it's all of that. So then art sort of, I thought, okay, I want to gravitate towards a place where I understand, or I'd heard that there was much more intellectual discourse. So in a naiveness, kind of gravitating to a cultural space which served as a haven. But at the National College of Arts at that time, there was this whole sort of focus on abstract expressionism, because again, that was the prevalent Euro-American engagement with the pictorial tradition. So I couldn't understand how to create a link to it, because this is pre-internet. So you can't figure out, okay, how do you relate to American art, like if you've never traveled. So, and then on the other spectrum is traditional arts, like the one that were recognized for their industriousness by the English, so like miniature painting. But it was not popular at all. And so I was curious in that kind of distribution socially of like what it meant, where my curiosity lay. So so I remember that kind of period of being instrumental, this kind of interest in learning a language. But and then, of course, it's an adventure in the sense that after I graduated in Pakistan, there was a lot of attention I received on the thesis I put forth, but there was still no interest to support young artists. And I was trying to figure out how to get a little bit of separation and travel. So India was the natural, the other. Living in Pakistan and India, you couldn't get visas to travel across. So I couldn't get a visa. Then almost every faculty member always went to London, obligatory RCA, Slade. And so America was so far removed. And I got a show for a day at the Pakistani embassy in Washington, D.C., came on a See America ticket that was given at that time to tourists, and it was a standby ticket for like a month or two. So I had a show for a day, and it was the Independence Day, and couldn't sell anything, and though it was priced under $50 or something. So I had all this work, small drawings, but nonetheless a lot, and I thought that I should call up schools. And so I was I kind of was inventive in that sense and resourceful, but it was an adventure, and I always thought so my father was like, if you can find money to support yourself and especially art, then sure, go for it. So that childhood engagement, culturally, like growing up in a Muslim family, where currently your understanding of that is so limited by what the media presents. But I grew up with a father that was a storyteller, and the value of storytelling was early on inherent in one's ability to imagine. So imagine something, imagine the future, and make it happen. Like that type of projection. So that's where some of that's sort of like the story of
Sure.
kind of coming to the U.S.
And
too.
so that what you last said sort of explains. At one point in the interview, you say, "I'm more inspired by writing." I'm taking it out of context, but there's at least a sentiment and awareness of, as a visual artist, you're saying narrative and story are, if not more important, equally important to other ways of being inspired, of making work. And is that, if I say that now, does that prompt you to think about the household, the storytelling at home, your father? Is that where you feel like that might be coming from? I mean, I know I'm taking it out of context, but
I think storytelling for sure, because a lot of the early story books were coming from Russia, but they were translated into Urdu. So storytelling was a personal, but also a literary space. And also in terms of, for me, I gravitated a lot to poetry. And there's a whole tradition of revolutionary poetry that is very prominent in South Asia. And I also, like, one grew up in going into Catholic, as a Muslim, when in the 80s, it's like religion is being institutionalized, but one is also like experiencing a Catholic schooling. Not all of everybody, but nonetheless, it was considered an important education. So the plurality that you're experiencing is it definitely allowed me to navigate multiple lenses in the US. And I think in the 90s, the US that I experienced was maybe the imagination had not yet been hijacked by the first Gulf War. It was like it was different from what it is now too. And this is of course the world shifted post September 11th. So stories are inherent in being echoed, and it's in their own time too, in terms of writing coming out from variety of regions.
So Phong, you're often the moderator, but now you are not, and so I get to ask questions.
I love it.
And one thing that I think always moves me, Phong wrote a beautiful introduction to this book, pieces of which he sort of cites sometimes when he speaks, but stories for you, it seems like we're almost an escapist mechanism, right? So it seems like you're in a circumstance that you don't enjoy, and certain books and stories become a mode of escape, which then in a way builds tools that become really valuable when you do end up in New York and you're able to interact with all sorts of people, on the basis of stories about other people. And, that's in a way different from what we've heard so far, story as a sort of source of inspiration, a kind of unbelievable personal narrative, and here's stories in the household. But it sounds like for yours, it really was story as a kind of escape or a vessel or a vehicle somewhere else.
Either that or get stolen and watch goldfish swimming in the fishbowl.
Is that right now or back then?
No, in the old days, in growing up in Da Nang. No, I think that, as I'm sitting here with exception you, Lucas, all Shirin, Jonas, and Shahzia and I are immigrant. I just realized this. And I think one thing about when you're an immigrant, you are perpetually caught in between states. You're not there nor here, in a way. And I think I can speak for some of us, but growing up in the divided political family and gone to westernized culture, as Shirin and yours probably described in a little bit, coming here, it's very confusing. It's very confusing. As a child, I aspired to work for the great Alexander Liberman, because Vogue magazine was in my home in French, and there are always wonderful photographs of the great artists, in their studios. And later on, in 1975, he did a book called Artists in Studio. And we have the copy laying around, and I remember reading it and fantasizing one day that I will be able to meet those artists. And so I went to college to become an art director. I was trained in every discipline in order to work for Condé Nast. what become of me is the Marxist version of it. But nevertheless, it has a powerful influence in a way how I felt coming to New York, particularly with that goal in mind. I don't know, some of you might have heard the story I told. It was during the interview with Ivan Chamayev, Chamayev and Gasmar, and also Hallmark, that I have an hour and a half to spend, and have gone to MoMA many times before with school trip from Philadelphia, where I gone to undergrad. But not this time. I was there in the museum alone, which I encourage all my young friends and students to go to the museum alone. Don't even take a date there. And I was there alone, and immediately having this privilege, complete solitude, in experience certain works of art. I remember I was perplexed by how strange the vertical line upon Matisse's The Piano that refused to hit the boy's head, which separate the space in the back, however flatly it was painted. And I remember how ferocious the Kunin woman won, that it refused to be in the center of the canvas, and doesn't matter how long and hard you look, you have no idea where she sits, so-called the non-environment. And previously, I have just read Joyce's Ulysses, and I was wondering how he decided to rewrite in the context of his time. And he talked about the epiphany of everyday life. And if you don't pay attention, it just escapes. It just goes very fast. And I had a wonderful teacher in freshman year, where you took eclectic classes, and it was Mrs. Jane Piper. My only time that I ever took a real painting class, and a la Matisse, like in still life setting. And I remember having a great time making it, but I was determined to be like Alexander Lieberman. Determined. And she said to me in the end of the class, "You seem to be a very willful young person. You will get what you want in life for sure. But I think you have a temperament of an artist. If you ever change your mind, you let me know." And that was it. It was at Marden Museum in the August 2nd, I remember, 1986. And that I have the epiphany. I thought of Joyce. I went to the cafeteria and I changed $5 worth of coins. Call Mrs. Piper. She happened to be in her studio. And I said to her, "I changed my mind. I want to be an artist. Where do I begin?" She said, "Well, one of my closest friends, her name is Mercedes Matter. And I used to be the assistant of her father, a modernist artist named Arthur B. Cars. I would call her tomorrow for you, and then you go there. That's where you begin." And that's how I came to New York with $200 in my pocket, start with the New York Studio School, and life changed. I mean, so much.
I would like to, you referred to us as immigrants, but I don't think we are really immigrants. I think we've just ended up here. You know, immigrants, we know what refugees, immigrants are, and they want to be part, and they get absorbed, and they become part of the population. But we were always somewhere else. We were never really part of this continent. I don't think we are now. I don't think we are. We are. Yeah. Each of us is somewhere else. We are. We transcended this thing called immigrant. We are somewhere else. We are not. Yeah. Immigrants. We may be, some travelers, some whatever we are here now. I don't know where
I'm
we
trying to
will.
squeeze it in because
Yes.
of Trump, Jonas. Hello.
Okay. I'm not an immigrant.
That's right. Speak for
I
yourself.
was just dropped here. I was dropped there. I was dropped in other places. I was then dropped here.
Yeah.
And I may be still be, someday will be dropped somewhere else. Who knows?
So time moves quickly when there are amazing people on stage. So we're actually going to open it up to people with questions. I think there's going to be more questions out there than there will be. And if there aren't, there are plenty more questions I have. So let's see maybe a round of applause for the speakers. And
Please raise your hand. I'll bring you a microphone so the rest of the audience can hear your question.
Hi, I have a question for Ms. Sikander. So may I ask something about your works? Sure. So what my question is that in all of your works, there is this occurrence of gopi and the gopi hair, right? And with time, you have developed a visual vocabulary regarding it. Like, it stands for different things in different works. Like, I understand why would you like dislocate the hair from the body? It's like dislocation and identity. What I want to know is why did you select gopi and gopi hair specifically? Did it just sort of expand it with your work, or was there like some prior insight on purpose that you wanted to, bring that in your work? So how did it just come about?
So let me just share what we are talking about. The gopi is basically a stock character that could be read as the female worshippers of Krishna. So they may be located within a Hindu iconography or religious painting. And so yes, so if I was within the context of miniature painting schools, which are Indo-Persian and they have local Punjab Hill schools in India. So when engaging this particular layering of tradition, which is very truncated, because the majority of it exists in Western institutions. So majority of it is in museums here. So ownership of who owns what is always in flux. And I acquired it by looking at books printed by institutions like British Library or British Museum or V&A. So it was a very indirect, non-nostalgic engagement. But nonetheless, at the heart of it was a kind of I always felt I was a detective wanting to understand and keep digging at this history, but not just at the history, but also digging in the direction of beauty. Like beauty, at what point does it become monstrous? Because the eroticness of the miniature definitely has a function too, whether you can see it in a multiple space. But then it's also is considered one was making small female pretty paintings. So there's so many things in there. Gopi is just one example of an iconography that has been culled from history, and I show the process of removal. So I'm demystifying it, but at the same time I'm interested in its iconography, which with particle systems, if it's multiplied in millions, it becomes fluid and static at the same time without changing the inherent nature of the icon. But motifs of that nature, it's like, how do you understand the character of a motif is very important than just taking the form of the motif. All right.
So, hello. I have a question about the other side of the equation and about interviews. So the idea of tell me something good. So I'm learning how to conduct an interview, which is not easy, but also to conduct interviews with artists who talk about their stuff all the time, and to try to tease, from my perspective, something new out of the artist, and that will be interesting to the reader. But what I'm interested in terms of the panel is, what makes an interview interesting for the subject? What makes an interview interesting for the interviewee? You can say, tell me something good, that puts you in the lurch kind of, but for you, any of you, what did you get out of being interviewed by the Rail that was more interesting than your normal non-Marxist media outlet?
I will interject that not artists. You say artists are always talking about their art. I disagree with that. The artists are. It's not easy to really make an artist to talk about their art. So it's that premise is wrong. Your artists are not so willing to talk about their art. And according to Matisse, they should never talk. They should first, before you want to become an artist, you cut your tongue out. That's my advice of Matisse. So you don't talk at all. Now you can answer the question.
Okay, Jonas. He who wishes to become a painter first must cut out his tongue. Well, I think that you don't talk directly. I think one of the way in which the Rail interview is so unique is that we are all encouraged to do very serious research. We read all the previous reviews, the previous interviews. There are things, I think questions are needed to be asked in order to recontextualize a certain situation, certain needed context. But otherwise, we try to ask new question and trying to work around it a little bit. For instance, just as Shirin was mentioning about that incredible, I think it might have been 8 years in the interview where she have gone as an undergraduate and graduate at University of California, Berkeley, as a painter, in fact, came to New York and met a visionary architect named Kyun Park, and they founded Storefront Architecture at the legendary place, where she actually gave a painting. Thank God she did. She gave a painting. I saw one of your painting somewhere, Shirin. She gave a painting, and she spent the next 8 years working with Kyun Park, creating panel discussion, inviting architect, theoretician, critic, writer, poets, all kind of walks of life in that creative fields and more. And it was that very specific years that she spent that she reshaped her, and I think the way that she think about herself as an artist. I think Woman of Allah is very significant in that matter, because you don't see it that explicitly, how the image appear as a minimal gesture of a Muslim woman that reveals such mysteriousness, but there is an incredible violent luring behind that beauty. And I always felt that that was the way to approach the artist, is to understand a few, I would say, key questions. And that question had to be allowing for its time when to ask. The great thing about the Rail also interview is that the artist is encouraged to talk as long as needed. And when people ask me who reads those interviews, and I always say the same, those that read. I mean, if 2 people read it, it's enough the effort to publish the interview. And I know over the year it's amassed quite a bit of scholarship. People who wrote essays, often quoted things that was being published in the Rail Artist interview, and vice versa. And it's really, really a project, I think, that is ongoing, and we can all get better at it. But you don't get better until you do it regularly, and I'm very glad you came on board recently.
You know, I think one thing that we haven't spoken about yet is the editorial process of the interviews. That part of, I think, what makes these interviews very special is the artists get interviewed, but it's never about a gotcha moment. It's not that you get interviewed and you never get to see the words again. You're invited, as the artist and the interviewer are invited back in to make sure that the statement accurately reflects what the artist believes. And of course, what that does, I mean, to sort of get at that question, seems like that creates real investment. It's not about, you know, getting as much information and then leaving the artist behind. It's about getting the artist to figure out how to craft a response or a statement that really does reflect what he or she believes. he or she needs to say.
I have discovered by reading interviews that and usually like by the same artist reading an interview, 5 interviews done during like 3 decades, let's say, where every time the artist is like saying completely different thing. And the artist is the last one to be trusted about what he is all about. Yeah, but it's for somebody who is interested in art. It's good sometimes to have reading to be it's entertaining, and you get something, you get excited, and you want to see. It's part of the whole thing that is art and everything that surrounds art. You cannot. It helps to, like okay, when I was in the 4th or 3rd grade in my primary school, and there was a shelf that contained all the books in the school, like maybe 200 books, and there was one shelf, the bottom shelf, full of dust and scraps of paper. There was a tattered, like a larger book, and it was a history of Renaissance art on very bad, printed on very bad paper. It's crumbling, all in black and white. There was no color at all. It was in black and white. I don't know, it was printed long ago, was crumbling, and I looked through it. It was this, and I thought it was very exciting for me to discover that book there with all those pictures. And I thought, maybe someday I will see them, And later, when I saw some of them, what I got the first time from those miserable black and white reproductions, they contained some essential thing there that related, that it was, I thought, I have seen it already. Like I saw, now it's richer, yes. But it was already, so you get some, you never know where you get what that helps you later to want to go and see the original.
So good.
So this book, I think, will make many, people to go and see the work of the artists in the book. Yes.
We have time
It's
for one
good.
final question, and
Hi. Well, this isn't really a question, but it's about something that Jonas said earlier when he was talking about the things that are around him. And he said that he deals with things that comes his way, and that's how he proceeds. And I want to tell you about a film that I saw.
That's how it is.
That's how it is. That's how it is. And I wanted to just mention a film that I saw of yours at Film Anthology. You were filming somebody in your experimental way. It was a person was the subject
I
matter.
never experiment. I just do it.
Okay, very good.
There is no
Very good. Okay.
experimental way.
Thank you for that correction.
Drop that.
I stand corrected.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll carry that with me into my film work. You were filming someone, and they were walking out of the door and down the street, and you were right on them, and suddenly this tree appears in the frame of what you're shooting, and you completely started. You panned away from the person you were shooting, and you completely got enthralled with shooting that tree in all these different gorgeous, beautiful angles. And it was just so impressive how you revealed that tree. And that image, that footage has stayed with me today. And I must have seen that about 15 or 20 years ago. So you, in dealing with things that come your way, it translates over into the work. It translated over into your film work. It's what I also heard you were saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a terrific note to end on. Thank you to all of our panelists tonight.